Welcome. So, this afternoon we're going to talk about what it's like to be a lawyer. First of all, there are some common misconceptions about what lawyers actually do in their day to day life. Um, I think most people have experienced the life of a lawyer through television, which, of course, is not an accurate portrayal of the actual nuts and bolts of the legal profession. One of the most important things that lawyers do is meet with clients. It's important when you meet with a client to establish rapport. It's important to make them trust you. So you need to sort of present yourself in a very professional way, a way that inspires confidence in the client. You also need to be able to ask good questions so that you can figure out exactly what your client has experienced, what your client is hoping to get from you and from this sort of transaction, and then make a determination about whether or not you can actually provide what the client needs. Some lawyers spend a lot of their time drafting documents. We call attorneys who focus on document drafting transactional attorneys. These are attorneys who deal, for example, with arbitrage or mergers and acquisitions in sort of the big corporate world, but that also includes attorneys in smaller firms who spend a lot of time writing contracts, drafting wills, drafting trusts, those sorts of things. So they spend a lot of time working on writing clearly and writing in a way that is legally specific, that's a difficult concept to sort of grasp, but it means that every comma matters. It's incredibly important that you choose your words correctly, that you order your sentences correctly, that you punctuate correctly, etc. Because all of those things may have legal consequences. Most attorneys, whether they're transactional attorneys or not, spend a tremendous amount of time engaging in legal research and writing. So attorneys spend time researching legal issues. They also spend some time engaged in sort of factual research, for example, talking to potential witnesses. But then they also spend a lot of time writing. And this can mean writing a complaint or an answer. It can mean writing a letter to your client explaining what's going on. It can mean writing a letter to your senior partner to sort of fill them in on a case and get advice. Or it can mean writing documents for trial or writing a motion either to a trial court or to a court of appeals stating a legal argument. Some attorneys spend a fair amount of time negotiating. So, for example, family law attorneys are going to spend a lot of time negotiating with the attorney representing their client's spouse, so that as much can be resolved outside of the courtroom as possible. Most civil litigation results in a settlement as opposed to a trial. This again requires some pretty significant negotiation. And of course, the vast majority of criminal cases are resolved through plea bargaining, something we will talk about later in the semester, which again is the product of negotiation. So having good negotiation skills is incredibly important. Of course, a fair number of lawyers spend at least part of their time in litigation. Litigation is what we refer to is the sort of umbrella term that covers all of the back and forth of a case that we typically associate with the practice of law. So this includes taking depositions, which is the process of talking to witnesses and getting their statements on the record. It includes motion practice. So before a trial, attorneys often spend time in the courtroom arguing over things like which evidence should come in, or what the jury instructions are going to say, or whether an expert is qualified to testify. All of that happens typically in a courtroom through the process of oral argument. And then, of course, there's the trial itself. Again, most cases, both civil and criminal, do not result in a trial, but some of them do. And there are definitely attorneys who really specialize in trial advocacy. There's a real skill to thinking on your feet, to interacting with witnesses and asking good questions, and to winning over a jury. Some attorneys, instead of specializing in trial practice, they specialize in appellate practice. So when your client loses and you file an appeal, or if the other side files an appeal, that process of drafting a brief for the appellate court, and then eventually drafting, engaging in oral argument in front of an appellate court, answering questions, legal questions, very quickly and extemporaneously. It's an absolute art. And some people are extraordinarily good at it, and that is their entire practice, is sort of managing appeals. If you are an attorney, depending on the size and structure of your law firm, you may actually spend a fair amount of time simply running a business. If you're a solo practitioner, or if you're working in a small firm, or even if you are, for example, a managing partner in a large firm, you may spend a fair amount of time hiring people, buying paper, picking, file folders to use, test driving new software. You are running a business. You have to pay the rent. You have to pay for the services that you use. You have to track down people that owe you money. So you have a client, you've billed them and they haven't paid. You've got to go after them, and that takes time. You also, of course, have to market your firm and develop a client list so that people keep walking through the door. Now that often involves having a social media presence or a web presence, and it often, depending on the type of law you practice, it may involve making commercials. And then finally, every lawyer has an obligation, if they're licensed, if they belong to the bar of a state, you have to have a certain amount of what we call continuing legal education in order to maintain your license. So it may be 10 hours a year. That means that you have to spend 10 hours a year sitting in a seminar somewhere, learning about something related to your field. So, for example, the Texas Criminal Defense Lawyers Association hosts a lot of seminars on death penalty cases and Innocence Project cases, and new developments in the law. And you can sit in on you pay, of course, but you can sit in on those and you learn and sort of stay on top of the field. Like I said, this is an obligation that that attorneys have in order to maintain their license. So in terms of what you do on a daily basis, so what does this look like? The average attorney works 49.5 hours per week. The vast majority of lawyers work more than 40 hours a week. And like I said, the average is about 49.5. If you work for one of the really big law firms that has offices in multiple cities and pays you, well over $100,000 to start, those types of jobs tend to be extremely busy. And it's not uncommon for people who work at those sort of big law jobs to work 80 hours or more a week. The way many attorneys have to account for their time, and this is leaving aside prosecutors and government attorneys, they don't have to bill people. If you work on a contingency fee, or if you're a public defender, you're not billing people. But many attorneys, every sort of unit of time they spend working for a client, they bill the client. You get paid by the hour, basically, or your firm does. And so this is a process called the billable hour system. Most people bill hours in 6 or 8 minute increments, although some firms still bill in 15-minute increments. And what this means is, let's say you sit down at your desk and you write an email to a client, and it takes you 3 minutes. Well, you round up, right? So that's a 6-minute increment that you spent on this client. And then you write another email, and that takes another 3 minutes. But again, you round up, so that's a 6-minute increment that you're going to bill to client B. But then maybe you go and you have to research a motion for one of client A's cases. And so you spend several hours uh, engaged in legal research. You may or may not be able to bill every single one of those minutes. First of all, if you leave your desk, if you take a phone call, if you go to get a cup of coffee, if you go to the restroom, etc., you have to stop the clock and start the clock again when you come back. But moreover, if you have to do some sort of foundational research, because maybe it's a new area of law for you, you don't pass that burden on to your client. Your client sort of comes to you expecting that you have a basis of knowledge. And so you sort of may have to do some sort of basic research before you can even start the clock on billing an hour. So what this means is that for attorneys who work in law firms that use billable hours, you have to track basically every minute of your day. Every time you get up and walk around, every time you go to the bathroom, every time you go to get lunch, every time you go to the water fountain, every single time you check your email, every single thing you do, you have to account for. And the law firms will typically set targets for how many hours you need to bill. Most big firms now, the target is billing 1,700 to 2,000 hours a year. That is simply to keep your job. If you actually want to get promoted, you're going to have to bill more than that. So, some of the pitfalls associated with being a lawyer. One is that the debt load that a lot of lawyers carry is astounding. The average debt load for a law school graduate is just over $164,000. That's the average. There are definitely people who graduate from law school with debt closer to $300,000. It can actually be extraordinarily high. If you graduate law school with $164,000 in student loans and you pay that back over the course of 10 years, that's more than $1,800 a month. So if you're making $60,000, $70,000 a year, at first blush, that seems really great. I mean, I think a lot of people in their late 20s would be ecstatic to be making that kind of money. But when you realize that you now have to turn around and pay $1,800 a month to the Department of Education, that salary is not looking so great. Another significant pitfall associated with the practice of law is maintaining a work-life balance. Rates of divorce for attorneys are very high. The stress level of the job is extraordinarily high. It's a low flexibility job. If you have a trial coming up, you have a trial coming up. You can't go on vacation. If you get sick, you've got to work from home because the trial isn't going to be delayed because you had a cold. So it's a very low flexibility job. It's very difficult to get away from the job, to leave in the middle of the day to see your kid play a little league game or things like that. So the result is that managing having a fulfilling life and your job can be extraordinarily difficult. One consequence of that lack of work-life balance and that high stress level is that mental health and substance abuse issues are extraordinarily common in the legal profession. In 2016, the American Bar Association did a report. They surveyed over 12,000 attorneys, and they found that of those 12,000 attorneys, based on self-reporting, 20% of them abused alcohol, 19% of them suffered from clinical anxiety, and a whopping 28% suffered from clinical depression. Now, that's self-reporting. We can anticipate that there were people who had, for example, drug and alcohol problems who didn't even feel safe answering that question on the survey. So these numbers are probably a little low. The issue of mental health and substance abuse within the legal profession is extraordinarily important. It's certainly important for the attorneys themselves because obviously these are situations that can lead to poor life satisfaction, poor physical health. They can cause, exacerbate heart disease. They can cause all sorts of hormonal imbalances. They can lead to self-harm. But as a society, we also need to be concerned about this because an attorney who's suffering from a serious mental health issue or a substance abuse problem is less able to do their job, to actually represent a client well, to meet the deadlines that they have to meet in order to represent their client, to make the arguments that they have to make in order to represent their client. It's incredibly important. And studies have suggested that 60% of all attorney malpractice claims and all professional ethics complaints against attorneys involve issues of alcohol abuse. So you can imagine how incredibly important it is to know that your attorney is mentally healthy, is managing their stress level, is not abusing alcohol or drugs, that this is somebody who is sort of in a position, in a mindset that they can devote themselves to your issues because they are acting as your representative. So the next sort of section in the module looks at the issue of attorney ethics, which is another issue that really is probably overlooked far too often.